Few periods in modern Irish history have been as formative or as momentous as the 3 years which elapsed between the general election of December 1918 and the signing of the Anglo Irish Treaty of December 1921. It witnessed four major developments, if you remember. First of all, the setting up of Dail as the de facto government of nationalist Ireland. It saw the beginning of the escalation of the Anglo-Irish War, the War of Independence, culminating in the Truce of 1921. It saw, affecting the North in particular, the framing of the passage of the Government of Ireland Act, 1920, an act which implemented the principle of partition, so long implicit in the debate since 1912, and secondly, created a separate parliament and entity in what became the 6 counties, the 6 excluded counties of Northern Ireland. And finally, in December 1921, this span of years saw the signing of the Articles of Agreement between the British government and Sinn Féin, which conferred a form of dominion status on 26 counties, a far advance on Home Rule, but contained no concrete guarantees against the continuance of partition. There is a reference in Churchill's papers to a nightmare which he had in the early days of January 1919, just after the Cocky election. Cocky election which had seen the return of a Tory-dominated coalition headed by David Lloyd George, the government that was to shape the destinies of Ireland in this period. And of course, Churchill was a member of that government as Secretary of State for the Colonies. He was to have a major input into the Irish question pre and post the Treaty of 1921. But he said he had a nightmare, and in his nightmare, the Labour benches in the House of Commons, which were beginning to grow after the First World War, were augmented by the unexpected arrival of 73 Sinn Féin MPs from Southern Ireland. And he anticipated really a Dantean vision of a political hell in 1919, 1920. And so exercised was Churchill about this nightmare that he actually rushed into the House of Commons at the opening of that new Parliament in January 1919 and scanned the Irish benches. And he wrote in his diary, "I rejoiced in the blessed abstentionism of Sinn Féin." Because Sinn Féin had stayed at home, as they had committed themselves to in their manifesto, leaving Joe Devlin and a handful of nationalist MPs, mainly from Ulster, to represent the nationalist case as partition began to loom large in 1919, 1920, in that kind of area. That reminds us that these years really are that the Parliament that dealt with Ireland in 1919 to 21 was really conditioned by 2 factors. One was the decision of Lloyd George, the former Liberal Prime Minister, and Bonar Law, the Conservative leader with deep roots in Ulster, to retain the coalition mode of government after the war. The Tories could have formed a government themselves. They dominated the post-war Parliament with over 500 members. The Liberals were only elected on Tory sufferance. But there was a feeling abroad in Britain that the man who won the war should win the peace at the Versailles negotiations in Paris. And so Lloyd George became Prime Minister, though this was to greatly impair his political freedom of action in dealing with a rampant Republican Ireland after the 1918 election. So you have a shift in the balance of power at Westminster. And part of that Lloyd George, Bonar Law coalition was a commitment, ruling out, first of all, any separation of Ireland from the British Empire. A republic, as demanded by Sinn Féin, was out. But secondly, so also was what the 2 party leaders, effectively the co-prime ministers of Great Britain, called the forcible submission of the 6 counties of northeast Ulster to a Home Rule Parliament against their will. In other words, Ulster would not be forced into a united Ireland under nationalist, or even worse, Sinn Féin rule. And as a declaration of intent, this statement was of great significance. It enabled the receding figure of Edward Carson, and more importantly, the rising figure of James Craig and the Ulster Unionists to support the coalition government, with Craig, Sir Dennis Henry, the Roman Catholic Unionist lawyer, and others becoming junior ministers in that Lloyd George coalition responsible for the partition of Ireland. And so in many ways, Craig, a canny Ulsterman, described by Tim Healy as like a rod of iron, he never bends. He warned Cosgrave and the pro-treaty leaders about Craig in the early 1920s. But Craig, sure-footed in the corridors of power, was able to keep a watching brief over the evolving British government's policy on Ireland in those critical months in 1919 and 1920. So we have that shift in the balance of power at Westminster from the liberal nationalist alliance of 1910 to 1912 to, in fact, a Tory-dominated government, a government which, as the historian Ronan Fanning put it, exercised a Tory stranglehold over Irish policy, dealing with both North and South in these critical years. And of course, the other factor, apart from the coalition and that shift in the balance of power, was the victory of Sinn Féin in the 1918 election, which had seen the almost complete repudiation of Redmondism as represented by Dillon and Devlin. There was no doubt that Irish nationalists were demanding independence in a form and spirit which had not been represented in Irish politics before. And yet, there was a flexibility in the Republican demand. Last week, Michael Laffen talked about the declaration of a republic, or rather, the reaffirmation of the 1916 Republic by the first Dail in January 1919, meeting in the Mansion House. One man who was filled with angst and disappointment when he read in print the following day that the Dáil had declared an all-Ireland republic was a Sinn Féin TD, then languishing in Crumlin Road jail. His name was Ernest Blythe, a Protestant from Maharagal in County Antrim, who had travelled all the way from an orange farming background to embracing the IRB, the Irish Volunteers and Sinn Féin, an unusual journey. And reading his newspaper in his cell in Crumlin Road jail, he was annoyed at the straitjacket of the Republic, which Sinn Féin, he believed, had got themselves into. Better, he believed, to have asserted sovereign independence and left a certain flexibility, because there was a flexibility in the minds of the Irish Republican in the streets, or the volunteer in combat in those years, 1919 to 1921. Even De Valera, the senior surviving commandant of the Easter Rising, as we always say, had said that, we are not Republican doctrinaires. The vote, he said in 1918, was for Irish freedom and independence. So it's interesting that, this was the issue that was to haunt Sinn Féin after the treaty was signed and put it on an inclined slope towards civil war afterwards. Michael Laffen has talked about the development of the independent struggle, the first shots at Solo Head Beg when two RIC men were shot dead in County Tipperary on the 21st of January 1919, the beginning of what was to escalate very slowly into a guerrilla struggle represented by the volunteers, redesignated the IRA, Ugly Naheran, the IRA, following Ernest Blythe's dictum that they should treat the RIC, the mainly Catholic police force, which had, if you like, ruled Ireland since the 1830s in one form or another, and the British Army as a force of occupation. Famous article in the Volunteer Journal on Toglach in January 1919. By April 1919, President de Valera arranged for a motion to be passed by the Dail at its second session, authorizing the activities of the volunteers in the field. And therefore we have a sense that the IRA from the spring of 1919 is operating as the armed wing of a democratically elected order in the first Dail, although in the countryside, in the counties, in the various theatres of war, as we heard last week from expert speakers, decisions were really taken by activists in the field, with very often scant consultation with GHQ in Dublin. And you have that growing kind of tension between Cathal Brugha, the Minister of Defence, formerly Charles Burgess, who Gaelicised his name after the Rising, and Michael Collins. Brugha was designated Minister of Defence in the first Dail, but of course Collins was the man who had the cachet, who had the éclat and the charisma, and who combined in his person so many roles, Director of Intelligence of the IRA, President of the Supreme Council of the IRB, Minister of Defence. By 1921, the TD for both North and South. That tension builds up between Brugha and Collins that's eventually to explode on the eve of the treaty completion itself. Sinn Féin's strategy, of course, had been to use any and every means to achieve a republic in the 1918 manifesto, echoing, by the way, as we know, the words of the Ulster Covenant of 1912, almost the self-same words quoted by Sinn Féin 6 years later. But they also had a peace strategy, which was basically to put the case of Ireland for independent status to the post-war peace conference at Versailles. That, of course, turned on the relationship between President Woodrow Wilson of the United States and David Lloyd George. And there was no way that America was going to risk its special relationship with Britain after the carnage of World War I. It was Joe Devlin who wrote to a political colleague in April 1919, just after the Dail began to meet, "Nothing will come out of the peace conference. The position must come to a fierce conflict between the government and Sinn Féin, and I'm afraid the country is in for a bad time." And that conflict began to escalate with the targeting of the police, with the charred line removing the RIC from the smaller posts, forcing them into garrison towns, backed up by a system of Republican courts orchestrated by Cosgrave and O'Higgins, reflecting Arthur Griffith's idea of moral force, separatism, of winning the ordinary population for resistance to British rule by a refusal to recognize their courts, their authority, and in many ways to force Britain to the conference table in that way. That was backing up the cutting edge of the IRA during this period. The British government's policy, it was to stumble, as has been said, between ineffectual repression and half-hearted attempts at conciliation. Lloyd George walking a tightrope, a prime minister without a party, as Lord Beaverbrook famously said in these years, saw Ireland as a policeman's job. His priority was to build up the paramilitary RIC, a mainly Catholic force, to suppress subversion. And as the conflict escalated, Lloyd George dare not admit, nor could his chief secretary, Hamer Greenwood, that Ireland was effectively in a state of war. And this will see the militarization of the conflict, the introduction of irregular forces by 1920s, the Black and Tans, the auxiliaries, the British government conniving at a reprisals policy as discussed last week, and all the while alienating the nationalist civilian population. The Catholic Church, which had been clamant in condemning the early IRA assassinations, became more silent as the Tans burned towns and assassinated innocent people in retaliation for IRA attacks. And all of this, as I know Alan will be telling us, had a massive impact on the situation in northeast Ulster. Ireland is yet undivided. No shots have been fired in anger right through that long Ulster crisis of 1912, right up to 1916. Even the Easter Rising, I think, occasioned only one shot fired in Ulster when the IRB's Dennis McCullough accidentally shot himself in the hand. But suddenly, all the bile, all the tension, all the ancestral hatred burst through in the summer of 1920, particularly in Belfast, where we suddenly find all-out kind of conflict with a sharp sectarian edge, with the Roman Catholic minority, 20% of the population, very much perhaps suffering the most severe casualties, almost 60% of the fatalities, of those almost 500 dead between 1920 and 1922. So the escalating violence in Ulster, but particularly in Belfast, an underworld with violent passions of its own, in Churchill's phrase. That's the background to everything that happens in the political field in these years. The Roman Catholic Bishop of Down and Connor, Joseph McCrory, later Cardinal McCrory, spoke in 1920 about a doctrine of vicarious punishment, whereby the nationalists of Belfast were held ransom for the misdeeds of their co-religionists in the IRA in the South. And that's a factor in these years as well. But of course, the British government was going to have to address the question of Irish self-government. There were mounting pressures. Pressure, for example, from the American government and the Dominions seeking some form of self-determination. On the other hand, of course, you had the reality that the Home Rule Bill of 1914, which had been suspended, was due to become operative when the last peace treaty was signed. Carson, the lawyer, was well aware of all of this. But curiously, it wasn't until the last months of 1919, a year after the Sinn Féin landslide, that the British government applied itself to Ireland. And it did so by setting up a committee known as the Long Committee, because it was chaired by Walter Long, an effective Southern Unionist, former Chief Secretary for Ireland. Now remember, the real dynamic in British politics at this time was some kind of compromise, because you had in power together men who were at daggers drawn only 5 years before, when the Tories, spewed the complete grammar of anarchy at the Liberal benches for endorsing All-Ireland Home Rule. So someone who said that Asquith and his cabinet should be hanged from the lamppost of Downing Street was likely to be at the same cabinet table by 1919. And so that quest for compromise is reflected in the secret kind of discussions of the Long Committee during that period. The Liberals on the Long Committee pushed very hard for statutory Ulster, or at least historic Ulster, to become the unit for partition. A 9-county Ulster, which would be less a sectarian unit as a unit which Britain had used as a convenient kind of area rule of thumb for the previous centuries. That would contain something like a 45% Catholic population, strongest, of course, in the West, and would overcome that kind of old chestnut of the dreary steeples of Fermanagh and Tyrone, which had haunted the compromise process from 1914. There was then the question of the long-term vision of the British government. The Liberals wished to see Irish unity evolve, and so the proposal was for home rule all round, home rule governments for North and South. The home rule governments would have limited but important power for the peace, order and good government of Ireland. And yet many of these powers, while they weren't concerning peace and war, were of essential importance in a divided society, because the 1920 Act was to give, for example, the Unionist government in Belfast control over education, always controversial, law and order, the evolution of policing, the electoral system, whether to have first past the post or PR, which was seen as a minority safeguard. So many of these powers, which were potentially to be devolved to a Northern Ireland government and parliament, were obviously problematic during this period. And then there was the question of relations between North and South. If, as the Liberal members of the cabinet hoped, Irish unity would evolve from two home rule governments within the empire, with just a very thin administrative line on the map, not the border etched in blood which would emerge from the violence of 1922. Some provision had to be made, some bridge, some bond of union between North and South. And this, the committee decided, would take the form of a Council of Ireland, with equal representation between both parliaments in Belfast and Dublin. Its initial powers would be limited. In fact, they would almost be insignificant. Railways, agricultural diseases, fisheries. But the parliaments would have the power to, if you like, achieve the unity of Ireland by consent, without further reference to Westminster. This was important if the British government was to strategically withdraw from Irish affairs. Ireland had been such a bog for British politicians, let alone a graveyard for the previous 50 years. Major matters would be reserved to Westminster. And the Irish electoral system would work on the basis of proportional representation. It had been trialled in Ireland in 1919 in the borough of Sligo and was seen really to reflect minorities, both home rule minorities and southern unionist minorities. It was believed, give the same kind of safeguard to northern nationalists. How did the Irish parties react to rumours of this bill and early reports of this bill going through the House of Commons? Well, the only people who were really consulted by the Long Committee at Westminster were the Ulster Unionists, still nominally under Carson's control, though he had been gravely undermined by his failure to deliver the 1916 Lloyd George scheme, destroyed by the Southern Unionists in the British cabinet. After that, Carson begins to recede, pleading age and infirmity, as James Craig, his finger very much on the Orange Unionist pulse, comes very much into his own in these kind of vital 2.5 years before the treaty. And I think the most important intervention was that of Craig. We have a minute from the Long Committee papers dated the 13th of November 1990. And it tells us what happened. Fisher, who was the Minister of Education, informed the committee that at Lloyd George's request, that's interesting, he saw Craig. Craig expressed himself against the inclusion of the whole of Ulster in the Northern Parliament and thought 6 counties preferable. The reason given, this is a quotation, was that Protestant representation would be strengthened. And he, Craig, also thought that 6 counties would be a union easier to govern than the whole province. This is the first intimation that the Ulster Unionists, led by Craig, were cold towards the idea of the 9 counties of the Ulster Covenant, including places like East Donegal, strongly unionist, and North Monaghan, considerably unionist at this period. And in his opposition to 9 counties, Craig had the support of Lord Balfour, the former Prime Minister Arthur Balfour, who actually told the committee he did not like the idea of Irish unity. And he warned that if a Hibernia Irredenta were to exist in Ulster, a non-redeemed Ulster on Italian lines, the difficulties of the Ulster Parliament would be added to. Not surprisingly, the British government could not afford to alienate its friends. Its enemies in nationalism and Sinn Féin were never going to work partition. And by February 1920, the full cabinet had overturned the Long Committee's recommendation of 9 counties. It's interesting to reflect on what Michael Laffen has written about this. He points out that the area of acreage, the acreage question, and the question of Northern Ireland institutions were interdependent. It was perfectly feasible to have a 9-county Ulster excluded from a Dublin Parliament, provided you didn't have a Stormont-type assembly, which required a majority, which could be very iffy in the event of a 9-county unit. It was also argued that a 4-county Northern Ireland would be ungovernable, or at least could not sustain parliamentary institutions. But then Luxembourg is smaller than County Antrim and is a self-governing state. And there is very little doubt that if, as Carson claimed, the Ulster Unionists had gone into the issue of ethnography almost parish by parish and townland by townland, they should have realised that a much smaller unit would have been more stable, shorn of the South Fermanagh and the South Armagh and the Bogside and the Cregan. One's reminded of William Craig, the leader of the Vanguard movement. In the wake of Bloody Sunday, a Stormont struggled for survival against a kind of an unforgiving conservative government. He called for the abandonment of South Armagh, the Bogside and the Cregan, and their immediate transfer to the Republic. But had this kind of thinking been the norm in 1919, 1920, the kind of stability of the resulting state of Northern Ireland might have been very different. The Unionists, led by James Craig, did fight a rear guard action. They didn't want a Council of Ireland. They wanted to minimise its powers. And in the end, by deft diplomacy against the background of the treaty, by 1925, Craig was able to excise the Council of Ireland from the package, though it was resurrected, of course, in 1973 by the Heath-Whitelaw administration. Craig also campaigned against proportional representation, which he described as a non-British system. And eventually, he secured a 3-year clause which would enable the Ulster Unionist government to abandon PR. It finally went, seen as a minority safeguard by nationalists in 1929. And essentially, the nationalists were not consulted at all by the British government. The Sinn Féin leadership had seen from 1918 blind to the potentiality of abstentionism in facilitating partition. And Ulster Sinn Féin leader J Walsh, a lawyer in Ballycastle, argued at a Sinn Féin meeting in early 1919 that the party had not sufficiently grappled with the Ulster question. Sinn Féin tended to react to events as northern violence intensified from 1920 onwards, and had no consistent policy really during this period. The Northern Nationalists were led by the highly articulate West Belfast politician Joe Devlin, the man who had reinvented Hibernianism as the social cement of Northern nationalism in the Edwardian years, a very astute politician. Devlin had supported the idea of exclusion in 1916, realising, as he told his friend Bishop O'Donnell, that this was one way of minimising Unionist power in the north and providing a series of safeguards for the minority. He saw an Ulster Parliament as cementing partition, and by 1920, looking at the draft proposals of the British government, he could write to his friend Bishop O'Donnell of Raphoe, "This is the worst form of partition, and of course, permanent partition." The 1920 Act did not become law until the 20th of December 1920. So the British government was in no hurry as violence escalated in Ireland, and they ignored the anti-partition rhetoric of Sinn Féin. It was very clear that Lloyd George's thinking was to establish an entity and parliament and policing authority in the 6-county area, and that would facilitate negotiations with Sinn Féin on the fate of the rest of Ireland, on the fate of nationalist Ireland. The Ulster Unionists, of course, abstained on the vote on the 1920 Act. But there was no doubt, as Captain Charles Craig revealed in a very telling aside in the House of Commons, he said the 1920 Act had given unionism everything it had fought for 1912 and 1914, and that no sane man would advocate a 9-county Ulster with such a flimsy unionist majority in the whole province. And this reflected the views of Craig, Major Fred Crawford, the gunrunner, and so many others of the kind of inner council of Ulster unionism. This was to offend, of course, the 80,000 loyalists of the 3 counties. Lord Farnham, the County Cavan landlord, felt shamed and dishonoured, as he put it, by the abandonment of the Covenant. But that's what actually happened in these years. How did Sinn Féin react? By January 1921, the Sinn Féin leadership were obviously aware that partition was bound to become a fact in the near future. They react in different ways. The recently returned De Valera, fresh from his American tour, advocated a policy of non-recognition. By abstaining from the new Northern Parliament, he said, Sinn Féin and nationalists would force a split in the unionist ranks, pitting unionist capital against unionist labour. It was Michael Collins who put forward a much more irredentist and a much more, if you like, full-blooded nationalist argument. The North, he said, must be regarded as akin to the old Pale. All of that territory must be redeemed for Ireland, he declared. But apart from abstentionism and a deal with Devlin to ignore the Northern Parliaments, there was no real policy on this. On the unionist side, Craig eclipsed Carson and became Prime Minister designate of Northern Ireland in the early months of 1920. By this stage, the reaction to reprisals was forcing the British government to rethink. Lloyd George was convinced of the, if you like, the sort of efficacy of a Dominion-type settlement for the 26 counties with certain, if you like, restrictions, including, most of all, the exclusion of northeast Ulster from an Irish state. And so as unionists look forward to partition, certain things fell into place. Certain of them were key things. For a start, in the summer of 1920, Craig pressed for the placing of the UVF on an official footing as the Ulster Special Constabulary. Churchill said, let's arm the Protestants. This would free up police and troops for action against the IRA in the south. By 1922, the USC would stand at 30,000 strong, and it would be the cutting edge of the force that would establish partition in disputed terrain like South Armagh and South Fermanagh. Secondly, of course, the South imposed the Belfast boycott in response to the sectarian violence in Belfast. Described by Churchill, a line that he borrowed from P.S. O'Hegarty, a major Republican figure, it was merely a contribution to the general hate, because the Belfast boycott of Belfast distributing trade and Belfast banks merely stereotyped the embryonic line on the map before executive partition had actually been achieved. And the third, I suppose, important event was the appointment of an additional Under-Secretary, not to Dublin Castle this time, but to Belfast, Sir Ernest Clarke. Famous glimpse of Clarke's credentials is given when he, in his conversation with James Craig, when the two men were introduced in London. And he was told this would be the midwife of the new Ulster Protestant state. And James Craig, in his 50s, the sort of wealthy stockbroker who had built up Orangism and a separate Ulster Unionist organisation from 1905, said, any man who serves Ulster has to have the word Ulster written on his heart. And Sir Ernest Clarke, an ardent imperialist, replied, there is no room. The words England and Empire are already written on my heart. And Craig said, you'll do. And he becomes a major figure in the establishment of the new state. A new state cemented that spring and early summer by elections for the new Northern Ireland Parliament. The Unionists, led by Craig, had a much more overwhelming victory than they ever expected, winning 40 seats. The Nationalists were divided between Sinn Féin and the old Home Rule remnant under Devlin, and failed to have an effective voting pact in that election. But the fault lines were clear. 2/3 of those who voted for unionism. 1/3 of those who voted for Nationalist Party. The majority of them for Sinn Féin, which was now beginning to expand, particularly west of the Banff. This is vital to Lloyd George's decision to enter talks with Sinn Féin in the summer of 1921. Because after all the peace feelers and peace moves, the two sides, Sinn Féin and the British government, had been skirmishing on the extreme edge of negotiation from January of that year. And eventually, of course, by May, Lloyd George's efforts in the north crystallised in a unionist parliament in Belfast. Churchill, a member of the Lloyd George government, a former reluctant Home Ruler turned ardent supporter of Craig, was to sum this up when he said, from that moment, May 1921, from that moment, Ulster's position was unassailable. And so the establishment of certainty in the north and unionist power in Belfast, backed by the Ulster Specials, enabled Lloyd George to send the King to Belfast on the 22nd of June 1921, when he made his famous speech, the grandiloquent gesture in Belfast City Hall, when he called for Irish men to forgive and forget, stretch out the hand of forbearance and reconciliation, and seek for the land that they love, a new vision of peace, contentment, and goodwill. His words echoed by Queen Elizabeth in Dublin exactly a year ago. The King had set the Northern Parliament in motion, but he had also extended an olive branch to Sinn Féin. By July, a truce had been agreed. De Valera met Lloyd George in Downing Street, where he unrolled his proposals for limited dominion status for the south, partition for the north. After various negotiations and crises, a formula was found, and so a Sinn Féin delegation, led by Griffith and Collins, entered Downing Street in October 1921. The Ulster issue was very much, if you like, a strange, abstract factor in tactics, in the words of Frank Pakenham, Lord Longford, in his famous 1935 account of those negotiations. Sinn Féin demanded essential unity. They put pressure on Lloyd George to deliver it. Lloyd George wanted Sinn Féin to accept crown and empire. And in the end, it came down to a form of words, a fatal web of ambiguity. The boundary clause of the treaty, clause 12 of the treaty, which held out the possibility of territorial aggrandizement for the south, but was a confusing clause because there had been much talk about the wishes of the inhabitants in the border counties and in Derry/Londonderry. But that was now subjected to economic and geographic conditions. Fatally, from the point of view of Collins, there was no provision for a plebiscite, as was being held all over Europe under the Versailles treaties, from Schleswig-Holstein on the Danish-German border to Silesia on the Polish-German border. And there, territories moved very often by very small percentages. 51% was a majority. As Harold Wilson said, a majority of one was a majority. But the lack of a plebiscite was to work against Sinn Féin and the Free State in the early 1920s. In the end, the Irish delegates returned with a treaty, dominion status for the south, restrictions on Irish forces, certain naval rights for the British government in Irish ports, which would have undermined neutrality in the event of war. Yet De Valera accepted that. But he was not prepared, as he said later in a letter to Joe McGarrity, the Tyrone man and IRB friend of De Valera. He said he was not prepared to accept the little sentimental thing, the oath of allegiance. And in those negotiations in Downing Street, partition had been subjected to the primary issue, the status of the new Irish state. And so in the end, while the phraseology of the treaty spoke of Ireland as one unit. Articles 12 and 13 allowed the North to opt out as a unit by an address of a parliament. That didn't happen until December 1922, and on the basis of the fact that legally the North was for 1 year part of the Irish Free State, citizens of the North could claim Irish passports for the next 75 years. But of course the treaty brought not peace but a sword to nationalist Ireland. Every organisation split, from the Dail cabinet, the Dail, the IRB, Common Naman, and most importantly the IRA. Attempts to ward off civil war failed despite De Valera's promise to avoid fratricidal strife. Historians would generally agree that if De Valera had used his vast influence in the scales for peace in those critical early months of 1922, the Civil War might have been minimised at least. But it was to come following the assassination of the military advisor to the Unionist government in Belfast, that archetypal Southern Unionist, Field Marshal Sir Henry Wilson, in June 1922. The British government demanded that Collins move against the IRA anti-treaty garrison in the Four Courts, and the Civil War broke out. So suddenly in this 3 years we've seen the outworking of the entire event, because as the South was rent with civil war, the North was able to dig deeper foundations for the northern state in the absence of a nationalist opposition in those locust years of the early 1920s. Thank you very much.